I've always been stunned that these men particularly are incredibly courageous until they enter into a conflict with their wife.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at, men who have been appropriately awarded Purple Hearts and major awards for courageous acts in the midst of a war zone, who are terrified to look at their wife and say, I feel hurt by you. Or I just want you to be proud of me. And I'm like, what in the name of God is going on here? And the answer is very simple. You can put your body into the realms of great danger without actually having to bring your heart into it.
Welcome to 3%. We're your hosts, Jamie Hay.
And I'm Blake Roberts.
We're two best friends, fathers, husbands, and just two guys trying to figure it out.
We're also therapists, which is probably a pretty important part.
That's true.
And we believe that at our best, people are 97% honest with themselves and others. And it's that hidden 3% of emotions, needs, desires, and behaviors that we keep to ourselves that keep us bound to shame and loneliness, from which many of our issues stem.
Each week on this podcast, we'll interview leaders in the fields of psychology, theology, arts, and athletics to explore holistic masculinity. We're not here to tell you the man you need to be, but we are here to help you explore what gets in the way of being the man you want to be.
We're going to help you develop courage and give you the tools to share your 3% in the relationships that matter most so you can more deeply connect with yourself, God, and others. So, pull up a chair.
Let's get into it.
So let's be honest. Let's be honest. Let's be honest.
All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode of 3%. You're going to have to buckle up today because we have a massively entertaining, wise, kind soul on the show. Many of you, influential, many of you will know. Some of you won't. To give a little bit of context first, Jamie and I found out about our guest today, Dr. Dan Allender, years ago. Me personally, I was introduced to Dan's work by my sponsor in recovery, who had done some workshops with Dan and had been acquainted with his work. And it just, reading his words and starting to listen to their podcast just opened the door into rooms in my soul and my heart that I didn't even know existed. And so I credit a lot of the work that Dan has put out in the world, and then by proxy, a lot of other people that have trained under Dan and also created work in the world as a big influential part of what led me onto the path of becoming a therapist. And so the fact that we're talking to him today is a wild full circle moment, and it's really exciting. So let me just give some context for those of you who don't know. Dan is a pioneer of a unique and innovative approach to trauma and abuse therapy, and he's really influential in I would say, kind of the merging of the Christian and the mental health spaces in a way that has been so needed. He's a father, a husband. He's our first grandpa on the show, which is exciting. He's an author or a co-author of, I couldn't count, I was trying to look online, but at least 20 books, I believe. A professor. He received his Master of Divinity from Westminster Theological Seminary, PhD in counseling from Michigan State, lots of other education, and he founded the Seattle School of Theology and Psychology in order to train therapists, pastors, artists, leaders to more effectively serve in the context of our culture today. And then I believe from that, the Allender Center was founded by Dan and his wife, Becky, Rebecca Allender. I know many people who have gone and trained through the Seattle School to become therapists, to become pastors, or to just engage people in their story in a more effective, holistic way. He's the co-host of the Allender Center podcast with Rachel Clinton Chin, which I've listened to probably almost every episode. It's got over 3 million downloads. It's fabulous in putting language to some really nuanced and complex topics. And he is here today with us we're going to talk a little bit about his new book, The Deep-Rooted Marriage. And so we're going to focus on, we talk a lot on this show about what does holistic masculinity mean. And today we're excited to be able to talk about that in the context of marriage and what does that mean for us as husbands and engaging in our wives. So we're super thrilled and just tickled that we get to have this conversation with Dan today.
Well, Blake and Jamie, so good to be with you. And just to get a context, 4 minutes before I came on with you, I beat my grandson in 3 games of ping pong. He's 6.
Nice.
He's actually really good. And like, it's not a huge challenge to beat him, but it's still like I had to do a bit of work. So
Started the morning off with a win.
It is. It's so sweet to be able to beat your grandchildren.
I can't wait for that day.
Yeah, that's the part we're going to clip right there.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That's incredible. Well, like Blake said, we're really interested on our show about forming holistic masculinity, really exploring it. We want to be careful not to tell men who they need to be, but to help them explore what gets in the way of who they want to be, especially in their families. And I think that ties in well to your book. And we had, in talking about this interview, we came up with this question that we thought we could just jumpstart our conversation with. And before that, like Blake said, and I just want to make you deeply uncomfortable again by continuing this brag sheet, but I do not think that Blake or I would be therapists without your influence in our lives. But I just wanted to start out with saying thank you, because both of our stories are not ones that were easy to navigate, and you really helped us along that journey from afar.
Yeah, well said.
To say, it's such an honor. And, in the introduction, the only other word I would have wished to have spoken would be the word troubled. I don't think you can do this work without being a somewhat troubled human. And troubled to have gotten into it, but then troubled by the privilege of caring. And when I say caring, I do mean caring, but I also mean carrying the stories of others. And it is an incredible privilege of being able to do what so few people seem to be able to do, and that is to weep with those who weep and rejoice with those who rejoice. And so I've looked at my career and just gone, I'm a billionaire, not in terms of what most people would put that word to, but in terms of the privilege of being with men like you. So thank you.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And I would say the last thing I would say, Jamie, before you ask your question is, because I meant to say this in my intro, the thing that I respect probably most about you, Dan, is of all the accolades and things that I mentioned, not to minimize those, as those are incredibly respectable. The thing that I respect most about you is that, correct me if I'm wrong, you would be the first person to say, even though you've written extensively about trauma and relationships and marriage, you'd be the first person to say, I was a complete child in the argument with my wife last night. Like, there's just a level of humility and a level
Wait a minute. Where were you last night?
Well, I'll answer that question. I was having my own childish interaction in an argument with my spouse, so maybe I'm projecting a little bit. Maybe I can learn something today.
No. Like, did you talk to Becky before you
That's
talked?
awesome.
No, it was over whether a baked potato was truly finished. That was it. Like, we have the baked potato out, and she's put a fork in it, and it's done. I put a fork in it. It's not done. And now we're off to the races on, and it took literally 3 or 4 minutes of fairly growing intense interaction for us to start laughing and going, good God, this is what 48 years of marriage has brought us to.
Yes.
We're in a significant argument as to, and I wanted to be able to go, we got to have an expert. We got to have somebody who is outside of us who can actually referee, is this baked potato? Because I was open. I was open to a different viewpoint, not hers, but to a different viewpoint. So here we are.
Jamie,
So
Jamie,
if
that's
somebody wants a book on marriage with somebody who can't deal with whether a baked potato. Yeah, this is going to be good.
Jamie, that's a perfect segue into your question.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, did you end the argument by saying put a fork in it?
We had already done it. Then literally, that phrase did come up.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Well, so here's the question that we had come up with. We've noticed many men struggle with the tension between cultural expectations of masculinity and a more holistic, emotionally engaged way of living. How do you think men can begin to reclaim a truer, more whole version of masculinity? And how do you see that impacting marriages?
Ooh, that's sweet. Well, let's just start with you don't see your own face unless you're looking into a mirror, or in this case, and I think God made us that way. You can't see your own face. You need the eyes of others. You need the voice of others. You need their gaze to be able to see what's true. Like in the interaction about the baked potato, Becky named again something that it shows up in the book as well, that the kitchen has been a war zone for us. My story holds a lot of heartache in the kitchen with my mother. She did not make food often. We ate Swanson dinners nearly endlessly. When she did make food, it was horrendous. But Becky's kitchen, it was the only place where there was love. The only place where her mother could show love was in how she served her family food. So just that alone is enough to go, this is a war zone. And so one of the things that I think is so important with regard to the question you're asking is, where will we face the depths of our own heartache and the depths of our own cowardice? Everyone's afraid. Everyone's afraid. So being afraid is not being cowardly. It's when you use structures, ways of being to escape that fear, that's what I would put as the word cowardly. So in the interaction with Becky last night, I was cowardly because instead of going, well, I don't think it's done, but what do you bring to this process other than more than 50 years of interacting in kitchens and 48 years of feeding me and your family? Why do you think it's done? What are the criteria by which you think it's... I mean, a simple question would have been courageous. But no, I just hid behind my own powers of intimidation. My voice got louder. I used stronger language. And it took, as I said, moments to begin to laugh because it was just stunningly ridiculous. But that's the context of, I do believe, the wholeness of a man comes in and through his capacity to deal with his brokenness. So it is highly paradoxical. It is counterintuitive that if you want to become more whole, you've got to enter into your brokenness. And then the question is, what's the language of brokenness? And I think for many of us, we immediately go to sin. We immediately go to where we fail. We immediately go to addictive processes. And those are not unimportant. Indeed, we have to engage those. But what we have to be able to ask is, what has brought you to be so defensive? What has brought you to use intimidation and a louder voice as a means of escaping even the discomfort of a disagreement? So I think wholeness comes in that willingness to be curious, to open the door to some of the hard things that have shaped us to be who we are.
Ooh.
Just letting that sit in for a second.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it brings me to somewhat of a follow-up, which is we need to look at kind of the question of how did we end up here, which requires deep vulnerability on the part of us to open the door to things that we have probably kept well hidden. Like you said, maybe through addiction or however we were able to create, I think you called it a structure of avoiding those things. How can someone start the journey then of moving towards that vulnerability? The thing that I quote you on that I was saying I tell to a lot of clients is, I heard you say at a training that engaging with the particularities of your story is how you can do harm to the forces of darkness that would otherwise oppress you.
Oh,
Yes.
It feels like when I say that out loud, that the host of heaven, as I turn to darkness, is not just saying, thank you for finally doing the right thing. It feels like the host of heaven is behind me, helping me do harm in a different direction.
wow.
And for many men, the turning is the scariest part,
Yeah.
because we're walking in this direction of darkness that feels familiar. But how does somebody begin the journey of reclaiming that vulnerability, that holistic masculinity, to start finding some hope?
I love that you all became dear friends in the context of a broken world and
Yes.
a broken context. And I think there's a sense in which some of the deepest friendships are formed in the valley of the shadow of death. And it's in, where you go, I am in the pit. I am in some of the darkest realms of my own heartache and shame. That when you have moments like that, and there's someone who sees you and doesn't flee and is not disgusted, they may be heartbroken and they may engage with hard words, but they are with you, for you, and in that sense, against the parts of you that are not you. So I need somebody with me. I need somebody for me. I need somebody against me. And I need them all in the same person.
Yes.
So I think friendships, Becky and I just passed our 48th anniversary. No one's been a better friend. No one has given me more of a taste of heaven than my wife. But what I would say is, and no one has brought me more of a taste of hell than my wife. And so being in a relationship of extremity, where there is this intersection of heaven and hell, is the context where we actually come to know something about the truth of who we are, both the truth of our brokenness, but also the truth of how stunningly beautiful we each are. And I think in so many ways, depending on the length of time you've been in any kind of religious community, it's not that hard to see your own sin up to a point. But seeing the staggering beauty, particularly in the realms of our brokenness, that's a hard one to, in one sense, take in. And yet relationship, and particularly I speak in terms of my relationship with Becky, she's a force. She is so kind, so playful, and unrelentingly committed to engaging not only my heart, but her own. So, when you have a partner, and in this sense, a partner can be one of your best friends, a partner can be your spouse, and may it be that your deepest friendship is with your spouse, then I think what you have is somebody who sees your face in a way that nobody else does. Nobody sees how deeply broken or how deeply beautiful I am as she does. So when I discovered that my knee is migrating, did you know knees can migrate, particularly with older people, because your tendons are tight on one side? And I'm having knee pain. And I went to my physician, and he basically said, "You're old and tight.
My
You're old
goodness.
and you're tight." And I'm
Thanks,
like,
Doc.
"Oh, can't we just do surgery?" And he goes, "You don't need surgery. You need to stretch." I'm like, I hate stretching. It's like flossing. It's just, no, I can't. I can barely do it. So every morning over the last probably 8 to 9 days, I have laid down early morning and done about 8 stretches. And when she came in the first, second, third day and just said, "I am so proud of you. You might as well have given me the Nobel Prize." Because her joy and honor of me doing something fundamentally ridiculous, working out on the floor with little stretches, is not exactly something that one should be hugely proud of. But she is. And even this morning when she didn't come in, it's like, she's still proud of me. And in that, the echo of delight. I mean, we are meant for delight and honor. And anyone who brings that to us, it's something that can echo in us, even if they're not present. So that's what I think is crucial for every man who wishes to become more of who he is and who he's meant to be. And again, that doesn't mean every man should be married. It just means every man needs a relationship with somebody who can see deeply and invite profoundly our hearts to enter what's true.
That's beautiful. I'm going to stumble through this, but something you said earlier when you were talking about the deepest friendships are formed in the valley of the pit of death. And maybe it's because I'm still fresh off of what we would call in our therapeutic space a rupture last night with my wife, because I am not to the point where I could say that ruptures don't ever happen anymore. And I'm also okay knowing that that won't ever be the case, but more of the focusing on the repair. So maybe it's because I'm fresh off of that last night. And in our parting ways this morning, even joking with her, probably out of my shame of like, well, I'm talking with Dan Allender today about deep-rooted marriage. Maybe I can learn something. Something that struck me as you were talking about that is, I'm thinking of Jamie and I's friendship. I said this to a friend the other day that there's within 8 years, there has been, not all at once, but collectively over that 8-year period, maybe a span of 2 to 3 months where we haven't talked at least once a day. And and part of that is because, if you're familiar with 12-step recovery, one of the bedrocks of it is connection, making phone calls, getting used to getting outside of yourself and connecting with other people. I said that to a friend and he was like, I don't even talk to my wife that much. And it struck me, an observation maybe that I'm making is, it is sad to me in some senses that the friendships that I have formed in the valley of the pit of death are in some ways easier than the relationship or the friendship with my wife. And that's because we don't sleep in the same bed, and we're not, there's so much more intricacies in my marriage than there is in my friendship. But what I was thinking, what hit me that kind of brought tears to my eyes is when you were talking about delight and honor as well, like needing that from each other. To also need that from somebody is for me to come face to face with the ways that I was not delighted in and the ways that I was not honored, which is like terrible heartache and what I get very defensive of. And something that I so respect of you that I really was able to witness in person when you came to Nashville to do the benefit dinner that I was able to photograph is the way that you delight and honor in Becky, the way that you look at her, just like the friendship that you guys have. I was thinking about that as it relates to my life, and that's something that I aspire to have. That's something I admire. And I don't know that I have a question in this. Jamie usually helps me pull out a question in my rambling. But to respect my wife, Shelley, to respect her, to find joy in her, in some ways is like painful because it's vulnerable to do that. And please go ahead, help me out here.
I'm just going to say that I've had the privilege of working with major professional athletes who are on a field of violence that's so intense that people get hurt often. Yeah. I've had the privilege of working with men and women, in the armed forces who have fought in Fallujah. And as they describe something of the world that they live in terms of facing injury or, in the other context, death, I've always been stunned that these men particularly are incredibly courageous until they enter into a conflict with their wife.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at, men who have been appropriately awarded Purple Hearts and major awards for courageous acts in the midst of a war zone, who are terrified to look at their wife and say, I feel hurt by you. Or I just want you to be proud of me. And I'm like, what in the name of God is going on here? And the answer is very simple. You can put your body into the realms of great danger without actually having to bring your heart into it.
Wow.
So when you
Jeez.
engage the one person who you have bonded yourself to for a kind of lifetime, in one sense, and I don't just mean lifetime years, I mean a life. Your life
Yeah.
is bonded. I'm telling you, that's a terror that most people have not honored to name. So the deepest war zone is love. The deepest war zone that we all face is the intersection between love and shame. And so when I'm petulant, when I'm intimidating, when I'm cowardly, when I'm just an addicted fool, those are the moments where Becky's engagement with me in truth-telling, but invitation. I mean, the question when you hear God speak to Adam, I wish I could do a computer voice right now, but the phrase, where are you, Adam? How was it spoken? Was it spoken with disappointment, with rage, with wrath, or with kindness and invitation and grief? So the reality of I have friendships that are trauma bonded because we've been in war zones together in one form.
Yeah.
Those are easier for me to have that level of engagement. But what you've described, Blake, is it's harder to be in a different kind of war zone and a different kind of valley of the shadow of death because your wife sees in a way that nobody else does.
Yeah.
And so she's going to, in one sense, bring something of your whole history of heartache, your whole history of shame, your whole history of the, where you have known not delight but mockery, where you've not known honor but degradation. And so a small interaction over a freaking baked potato is a war zone. And I think because we've been doing this, and to be honest, writing the book was really helpful. I've written other books on marriage that I'm very fond of, but this particular work, looking at the interplay of trauma, developmental trauma, past significant capital T trauma, and asking the fundamental question, how has it shaped how I'm triggered? And then how does it shape how I disengage or engage in a way that is not honorable? Writing the book has been really helpful for our marriage because it's intensified, in some ways, the necessity for both of us to tell the truth to each other and to ourselves. And though I would say we've done that before, we've had to do it at deeper levels.
As I'm hearing you talk about this, I'm reminded of this phrase that I stole directly from a marriage conference my oldest brother went to, and I use with a lot of my clients, which is noticing when you are in a cycle of miscommunication, when 2 + 2 has ceased to equal 4, and instead 2 + 2 = 10, and understanding where did that other 6 come from. And some of the work that you're talking about doing is realizing the other 6 has nothing to do with the cycle of communication between the two of you, but rather the wounds that are being pushed on by that cycle. And even for me, Blake knows this, very recently in my own counseling, it's so interesting how over the course of counseling, parts of me finally release their hold and come to the forefront. But with my therapist recently, we were able to name that a part of me that I had just misnamed as something for so long is actually trying to rage all the time. I have some big T trauma. This is something that our audience will know at this point. I was abused by a youth pastor for 8 years, and some of that is just left me with wounds that I thought were only to do with that. And I think also it compounded wounds from childhood, these wounds of if I don't protect these with rage, with strong response, then I will not be cared for. I will not be safe. I will not be cheered on. I will not be sought after. And so I have to choose to seek after me, which is shows up as selfishness. But I have to choose to seek after me, to keep myself safe, to prioritize me, because I can't trust anyone else to do that. And this was, Dan, this was probably a month ago. And it hit me like a ton of bricks that in my marriage, I will have been married for 10 years this year. In my marriage, I have been just a jerk with not trusting my wife to be for me, to keep me safe, to prioritize my needs, to seek after me. And so then the 2 + 2 = 10 ultimately for us in these cycles has long been, well, I don't believe that if I give you the opportunity to show up for me, that you will. So I'm just going to shut down or manipulate you or try to get you to see how this is your responsibility so that I can remain safe. While it seems like I'm saying this, I really want the audience to hear that that felt relieving to me, to be able to name it. It made me sad, but it also felt relieving to me to be able to go to my wife, who that didn't make our relationship perfect, but it felt relieving to go to my wife and to be able to say, I'm so deeply sorry for the ways that I have allowed rage to put you on a different team.
Oh, it's so well said and heartbreaking. Again, heartbreaking. That what you've described again is the journey of what I want people to walk through with the deep-rooted marriage. That is, Becky has a history of past sexual abuse, significant. I do as well. And yet, for those who do, yeah, indeed, to think that capital T trauma like that is not going to show up in every dimension, sexually, relationally, regarding how you handle, I mean, across the board. But the dilemma is when you have significant heartache like that, it's so easy to, in one sense, minimize the other realities. So, I mean, I learned with what I would call a borderline personality disordered mother who could be sweet and kind and then cruel within seconds, could be pathetically weeping and then literally ripping the kitchen apart, throwing plates against the wall. So I lived in a world of such unpredictability that you just never knew. So I learned to be incredibly attuned. My survival depended upon it. But my greatest protection with her, and then eventually with other abusers, was to be crazy. Now, that can include being enraged, but it also might mean that, I drive your bicycle into a car at 20 miles per hour because you pissed me off. Now, I ended up, of course, getting hurt, but at least I ruined your bike. So, and then when people know that you're crazy, it's actually more dangerous than being enraged, because with rage, there are parameters, but with craziness, you don't know what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
So we all intuitively and largely unwittingly, unconsciously, we create structures. And those structures, those ways of being in the world and in relationship, good God, of course they migrate with us into our friendships, into the way we do our business, and certainly, most certainly, into our marriage. So
Yeah.
that's where, I think many people settle for convenience and comfort, which are not bad. But when that's all you're really looking for is convenience, comfort, for some pleasure, good sex, happy, enjoy going on a vacation together. Again, faulting none of that, but simply saying there's a larger domain here, and that is the invitation to reality, invitation to what's true about you, and in that broken, beautiful, the stunning, stunning goodness that we each bring to the world will be, to some degree, hidden when we're in bondage to having to present what generally is called a false self. So nothing provides us with, I think, a greater realm of revelation than our marriages. Now, in that, will I receive? And I think most pointedly, will I receive the kindness of God? Because I believe that how he spoke to Adam was not with a voice primarily of disappointment or rage or irritation, but truly of grief and invitation. Where are you, Adam?
Yeah.
So when we hear the beckoning call of the Spirit to enter into what's true about us, particularly in the context of our marriage, really amazing things can happen in terms of transformation, which will take at least 48 years to be able to have a fight over a baked potato.
That's right.
And pretty quickly,
Yeah.
but largely with laughter, but not without some debris.
Yeah, which there's something encouraging about that, and hearing you share that story. You've named that there's so much richness in this conversation, and you've named this a little bit as we've been talking, but I want to make it really clear for the listeners. Why this book? Why now? Who's it for? And what is your hope for somebody that gets this book into their hands? I imagine it's not merely to gain more knowledge about marriage, but something much deeper. So why this book now?
That's a fabulous question. And I think the answer is I don't know how many more years I have with my wife. We're knocking on 73. And we're in the dying age. And we just yesterday spent 30 minutes weeping with a dear friend whose wife is dying of pancreatic cancer. So I think in some ways it was an ode to my wife, a way of saying, this is what you have brought me, and I am so grateful. And I'm still grieved for something of the harm that I continue and we continue to do. So I think, who's it for? I hope every human being in the universe. But really it was for my wife, and then for my children, and then for my grandchildren. It's something of what, it's not a marriage memoir. So we do tell stories. Becky responds to some of what I tell, as my co-author Steve Call and his wife Lisa do as well. But in that sense, when we live in an age, and again, I don't want to veer off into sociological, political stands, but we're living in a day of incredible untruth, incredible deceit, incredible rage, polarization. I do think what will cohere our country and our church is the quality and depth of honesty and humility in our marriages. So I'm not a political force or figure, but I can't help but see in churches, I have good friends who are pastoring in, and they are just driven to a point where they don't want to stay. They don't want to stay in ministries because the level of rage is so severe. It's got to be showing up in marriages. So I think from the standpoint of my age, and then the age, I thought it was time to write much more clearly about the intersection of the effects of trauma, that small t, capital T, in and with marriage, with incredibly the hope that, again, I hope it's not being heard by our audience as trivial, but that you really can get through a baked potato conversation and have laughter. That you can deal with hard issues that I think, again, it's a brilliant way of putting it, Jamie, that, 2 + 2 = 10. Something's being added here. Where do you actually go to be able to go? Let's at least ferret out some of what might be involved in that 6, so we can come back to, again, the power of goodness and truth. After we began laughing, one of the things Becky said was, the oven's at 425, and you plan to eat half of it. I was planning to eat half. You get to decide with your half what you want to do. And I'm like, yeah, it's actually a pretty creative, but we had to deal with each other before, and she took her baked potato and mine went in for another 4 or 5 minutes, and mine was perfectly done, whereas she ate a slightly hardened baked potato.
That's right. That's right.
And to deal with each other, I don't know if you would say this is true for you. The way I'm thinking of it is I must first deal with myself. When I think back to my conversation last night, I think some of this can be kind of the, not everything is pure. Some of this can be the negative, I don't know if negative is the right word, but impacts of being a therapist is I'm often sitting with people in some sense wondering where am I internally and how that impacts my work in the room. But mostly I'm wondering, where are you? And what's getting in the way of where you want to be? And as much as I don't want to admit it, that question, where are you, that I can't call him a mutual friend because we're not friends yet, but we're going to have him on the show, Chuck DeGroat, when he talks about the question, where are you, as in the way that you're saying from God's invitation with kindness and grief and curiosity rather than judgment. Gosh, the amount of times that in arguments or in conflict or in rupture, I'm internally asking or externally asking my wife the question, where are you? Like, what's getting in the way of you? Essentially saying, like, I don't have any part in this disagreement or this conflict right here. It's you, and you need to find it. Or better yet, I'm a therapist and I can help you find it. And this whole conversation, if I'm taking anything away from it, is in those moments to trust that my wife, and not just my wife, but to trust that God's work in my wife can allow her to ask her own question of where she is, and I can focus on where am I in this moment? Where am I, and where have I come from that is influencing this? And to do that requires me to do the really hard work of engaging, like Jimmy said earlier, the particularities of my story that lead me to believe that God asks the question to me, where are you, with judgment, with hostility, with rage, and then it comes out the same way from me to my wife. So it's like the more that I can ask myself where I am and believe that God is asking me in that curious, gentle way, hopefully that flows out to my wife when I'm asking her the question. But that's not the first thing, because I need to focus more on me and less about what I think she needs to change in order for us to be better.
Yeah, we spend a section on what it means to address the log in your own eye. And I think, again, most of us presume the log is something sinful, when I think the passage makes it very clear it's about judgment. You make judgments, and another word for that is contempt. You have contempt, and the core for many of us is we may have contempt for others, but we've not addressed the contempt we hold for ourselves. So when Scripture says, like in Romans chapter 2, verse 4, it is the kindness of God that leads to repentance, not truth, not holiness, not confrontation, kindness. Now, kindness is never nice. Kindness has a kind of bold invitation to goodness. Well, that's what Becky was doing last night, making a bold invitation to the fact that I'm a little bit out of my mind. And whatever the judgment I'm making, it's not just against her or against the baked potato. It has to do again with a larger history where in the kitchen, it's a war zone. So can I walk into almost any interaction in the kitchen and know this is a place that has held for me so much heartache and so much shame. Remember the day that Becky looked at me and she said, what was it like to go shopping in like a supermarket with your mother? And, you know, I'm deeply appreciative of the therapeutic work that's been done on my behalf with all sorts of good folks. But nobody had ever asked that question because there wasn't the context. And I'm like, as soon as she asked that question, I could feel terror and rage because it was a nightmare, an utter nightmare. There were many moments where my mother would collapse in a supermarket and begin weeping. And I would need to not only get the cart moving, but get her up off the floor and proceed through all the eyes staring at this bizarre drama happening in front of them. So it shouldn't be a big surprise. Going to a supermarket is not a joy. Then over COVID, where I'm home in a way that I wasn't ever before, I started having to go to the supermarket, having, forgive the phrase, big ass responses. And having, again, somebody that you can begin to metabolize. But at least with me, when you're near matters of shame, well, I'm not going to be genuinely open, curious. Why isn't this really fascinating? Yes, let's help dismantle the power of this kind of internal structure. I push back. I get crazy. And so to have a brilliant, beautiful, kind, but also to some degree fearless wife who's willing to step in and go, you're just out of your mind right now. And I'm not interacting with you, but I will interact with you when. And in that process, now we're back to what you both have put such words to. There is healing in telling the truth.
Yeah.
But in telling the truth, there's always a kind of humbling. If we make the error of bringing that we have known moments where we've been exposed and humiliated, being humbled and being humiliated, they're pretty close linguistically, let alone to actual experience, which is why I desperately need a face that is kind, not making her point, not demanding. But for both of us, that's something that had to grow through her horrid experiences with a mother who regularly ridiculed and shamed her. So the process of marriage is meant to be a redemptive context where the very worst and the very best begin to play together in a way that invites you to redemption.
So well said. I want to say one thing really quick that I'm like hearing a listener, what a listener might be thinking, because I experienced this in the therapeutic room of a guy thinking, well, I don't have a story like Dan's. Like, I don't have that intensity in my family of origin that Dan has. So therefore, like, is it really, like, can my family of origin really be influencing my marriage in this way? Because we can get into this place where we're competing with stories of harm, or we're stacking them against each other to say that mine must not really be that bad, and therefore it's something in the present that needs to be focused on, not something in the past. And that couldn't be more further from the truth, because everybody's story is their own unique experience, and not at all to minimize a horrific story like Dan's in the supermarket. Like, I'm thinking about even my own kids. Like, think I can say this. I or my wife are not going to be to the place, because of the work that we're doing, where we are having meltdowns in the supermarket the way your mother did. However, we are still imperfect, and we are going to do or not do things that make our kids feel a level of responsibility for us and for our emotional state that is not theirs. And so it kind of brings me to this maybe just like comment I'm making of like, regardless of what your family of origin story looks like on paper, may not be that significant as somebody else's, there are still intricate ways that you were impacted by that. And it's not about, shaming or blaming our parents, but it's about looking at the truth of the whole picture to go, how, like, these are our most formative relationships that we have in our whole life. And so they're impacting the way that we show up in relationship today. Just like you said, I think it's a quote on my website from something you said, where if we want to have a different future, we must have the courage to look at the past and not compare our past to somebody else's, but look at ours.
Oh, you're right on target in that. Look, my story, as bizarre or crazy as it may seem, is so much easier than most.
Yeah.
That everything's pretty clear.
Yep.
A extraordinarily passive father who would not speak, literally, sometimes for days. A shrug, a word. I often called him multisyllabic, meaning, no, fine. But I would, the more subtle, the more satanic. You grow up in a really good family. You grow up with good sibling interactions, and you go, well, you wouldn't, things should be pretty easy for you. It's so much more subtle and so much harder to face the parts that actually shaped and formed the war that's within you. So I mean, I'm sure it sounds insane, but I prefer working with highly traumatized people because it's so much easier than working with people who had good, and I mean it, good backgrounds, good lives, good worlds, because the depths of that war are far harder to face. I've looked at how my children, who I think grew up in a pretty significantly different family than my family or Becky's, and yet, again, having adult children, the oldest 46, youngest about 38, and having them talk about what it was like to be parented by us is very humbling.
Oh,
because we've given them the power to see and the power to speak. And so being able to say, Mom, your kindness at times is incredibly passive aggressive. And it's like, yep, that's really true. Now, how do you grow up with a mother who's really remarkable, but also passive aggressive? And then, Dad, you could handle, the big tragedies in our life, but you were like a monster when it was like a small matter. So, we knew that if terrible things happened to us or we did terrible things, you had a grace that was amazing. But like if we were late 5 minutes, you were like Attila the Hun. And I'm like, oh, wow. God, like you just can't be a parent without, in one sense, the awareness that if forgiveness is not true, you're dead in the water. So all the framing of what you're naming is family, your relationship with your own mother and father, your relationship with your spouse, your relationship with your children, your siblings. This is the petri dish for the realities of your life to be seen in a far greater light. And if that context does not drive you, cause you to move with even deeper hunger to who is God? What does it mean to follow Jesus? And what does it mean that the Spirit's perfecting something of the work of the cross within me? I mean, my family is what often brings me to a kind of level of war that only the Psalms speak of. So back to that framing. My story may be weird, but yours is weirder.
That's very well said.
It makes me think of what Jay Stringer talks about in his book Unwanted, where he talks about honoring your story and your family of origin through honesty. And it's not dishonoring your family of origin to that person that you're talking about, Blake, and in who's listening to this going like, I had a good childhood,
Yeah.
and I don't want to speak bad about my parents because I love them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's yes, and you are not dishonoring your parents by being honest about your experience. You are honoring your story through being honest about your experience. And I think also on top of that, what I've been thinking about while we've been exploring this is one of the gifts of friendship, which is what, Dan, you said was such a catalyst for starting this work and finding hope. One of the gifts of my friendship with Blake is having a safe place when my marriage highlights my need for growth, having a safe place to go and work that out that doesn't require my wife to take hits that she doesn't deserve.
Yep.
And I think that's been such a gift of friendship. And to anybody who's single listening to our podcast, because I also think there's a lot of those guys, and I feel like this could feel lonely if you're listening to a marriage podcast and you're single. But
If they're even still here at this point.
if they're even still here, I do think, like Dan said, you can get a real image of this through a deep friendship. It just matters how you bring yourself to the friendship.
Yep. Very well said. Yeah.
Absolutely. Again, I've had my dearest and deepest friend since I was 13, Tremper Longman III. You know, we just found out today of another dear friend's daughter-in-law who has been diagnosed with cancer. So who do you go to when you just want to scream at God? But I'm not opposed to screaming because that's part of what the Psalms demand. They don't invite, they demand.
Wow.
We're never meant to only scream alone. And that sense of who do we weep with? Who do we scream with? Who do we laugh with? And again, I think of a number of friendships I see in our church with men between 20 and 35. And one of the things that we've done is to name that if you're just hanging out with someone, just hang out. It's fine. Go to a movie, play pickleball, go hear a concert together. Are you utilizing those conversations and those experiences to explore your past, your future, and living well in the present? So if all you do is you're killing time, that is murderous. But time, you know, if you're with someone who matters to you, somebody you're dating, a dear friend, your spouse, if you're not redeeming past and future, then what do you have in the present? And part of redemption of the past is the ability to grieve together and laugh, and the ability to imagine who am I meant to be? And I think that's one of the reasons we wrote this book. I wanted to imagine who I might be if my heart was even freer to love my wife. If I've got 3 years, 5 years, 8 years, 10 years, 15 years left, I probably don't have decades left on this earth. I want my last moments with my wife to be those moments where I can say, I have seen the goodness of God in the land of the living. Therefore, I do not despair. So that's where I want to live a life that ultimately says death does not get the final word. Love does. Life does. The presence of the resurrected Jesus does. And if that's what a person's living in and with and for, hanging out, playing, having fun, grieving together, raging about this dear friend's daughter-in-law, it is what our bodies were meant to know.
Yeah. That's beautiful, Dan.
I have goosebumps everywhere.
Yeah, me too. We could take up so much of your time. You've been so generous, and that feels like a good place to start to land. Hey, Jamie, unless you had something else that you wanted to ask or say, I wanted to read a little, just a couple bullet points about the book, and then we can start to wrap up. But I didn't want to cut you off if there's something else you had.
Well, there's plenty I want to ask, but another time.
Yeah. Part 2. If it's not already evident that if you are in a marriage or want to be or soon will be, that this book is something, and just Dan's words and Steve's words can be something to be a partner in that journey with you. I was looking up the website about the book, and I saw these bullet points that I just wanted to read because it probably gives a pretty clear picture and some clarity about what to expect from this book, with over a combined, this is amazing, a combined 70 years of therapeutic experience between you and Steve. This book that is just demonstrating how God can invite you and your partner to a wild faith. I love that language. If you are listening to this and you want any of these things, address past trauma, giving you a greater courage and compassion to engage your present struggles, disrupt cycles of conflict based on shame, judgment, and resentment, create safety when feeling threatened, which is really important, and offer attunement, empathy, and honor toward differences, adopt humility, honesty, kindness, curiosity, defiance against what divides, an intention to bless. And then this last piece is so beautiful. Learn practices that cultivate emotional intimacy, generating new goodness between you and beyond you. Go get the book.
I like that. I'm not sure I've actually seen that, but that's really well said.
Well, it's somewhere on the website. I think it's about the book and the companion guide describing. It's beautiful. And so go get the book. I believe is it still on pre-order or is it out at the time of this recording?
It is out there.
It's out. Go get it. It'll for sure be out by the time this launches. And I mean, Dan, if it's not so clear enough already, so grateful for your well-lived life, maybe I would say, and the intention that you have put into not just engaging your own story, but helping others engage theirs and pushing back against the darkness. It's been a blessing to a lot of people.
And Blake, again, my part of my great thrill, even in doing this, but let alone your lives, is, we really want goodness for others. And when you alone know something of the cost of engaging others is the constant labor of being willing to have something of that light shown in and through you as to what you need in order to grow. And it becomes, again, the paradox of we who are beggars truly indeed are the ones invited to the feast. And at the feast, beggars are the ones who are most apt to share. So I'm grateful to be with two other beggars.
Yeah,
beautiful.
So grateful.
Yes. Thank you. We end every episode with this phrase to our audience. They'll be familiar with it. Thanks for being here. Keep coming back. You're worth it. Hey, thanks for tuning in to another episode. Listen, we're working on some really practical resources to help you connect more deeply with yourself and others. So if you head over to our website, 3percentco.com, you can learn more about that. The link will be in the show notes. And this is the part of the show where we ask you for some help. Listen, we don't have a big fancy production team. We're recording these in my therapy office in between sessions and in the margins of our life. We just really believe in the message that much. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and rarely would I take the time to review and rate a show, just because honestly, I forgot. It wasn't until we started doing this show that I realized doing that actually really does help these platforms notice our show and get the word out. And so if any of this is impactful to you, we would love it if you took a second to leave us a review, rate us, or if you want to just do it the old-fashioned way, text this link to a friend and say, hey, let's talk about this episode. Whatever you do, make sure to follow us on whatever platform you're listening to so you never miss an episode. We're really grateful you're here, and we'll see you next week.
So let's be honest.